warlord of the nation. He's the hippest cat in creation.
Hello and welcome back to Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics, the podcast where we're taking a chronological look through the so-called Walt Disney animated classics to see which ones really hold up to that lofty title, albeit in our case a Waly Gisnep animated classic. As always, I am Liam and I am joined by my very good friend Ben. Ben, which film is up for consideration this time?
This week, Liam, we are staying in the year 2000. After Dinosaur, we are looking at The Emperor's New Groove, a film that, like many of the Disney films, started in one direction and ended up with a very, very different end product. I'd say we are firmly into the post-Renaissance sort of experimentation era, where Disney was trying a whole bunch of different things. So obviously, Fantasia 2000 revisited the Fantasia format. Dinosaur was an attempt to do a full CGI movie, albeit with live action backgrounds.
And no story.
And although the animation and structure of The Emperor's New Groove is much more within Disney's wheelhouse, this is Disney's first real attempt at just an out-and-out comedy. What's your background with this film?
First of all, I have to agree. I think if you remove Fantasia 2000 and Dinosaur for their respective reasons, I still think people would see The Emperor's New Groove as the start of the post-Renaissance, because it is very different from anything that has came before it, and really, I think anything they've done since. This is a film that I didn't have much experience with when I was younger. In fact, this was only the second time I've watched this on my own. However, it's a film that, starting in university and really for the last decade or so, whenever I'm with a group of people, it somehow always seems to find itself on, and I think I've probably watched it a dozen or so times in a group setting, so I've seen it a fair few times, but I've rarely chosen to sit down and watch it. And again, all of those viewings really are when I'm an adult. What about you?
So we're a little ways off Tangled chronologically, but when Tangled came out and I found out it was number 50, that was really the time when, as an adult, I decided, right, I really want to get into watching all these old films. And that led into me doing my first watch through of all the animated classics. And that's the first time I saw The Emperor's New Groove. I remember when it came out, I think I was getting to that age where I was a little bit too cool for school and thinking, oh, this is a bit lame. And I just wasn't that into it. I thought from the trailers it was trying a little bit too hard.
I completely get where you're coming from. This is a massive departure for Disney. It is probably the most overtly comedic of the animated classics. And weirdly enough, I wonder how much of that actually comes down to corporate espionage. This is our first example, I think, in the animated classics where we have the telltale signs of corporate espionage going on between Disney and DreamWorks in this case. Because, for those of you not familiar, this film started production a lot earlier, I think around the time of The Lion King's release, as a much more traditional Disney musical set in Incan folklore called The Kingdom of the Sun. And it was basically in development hell for a very long time. But one thing that's interesting about that timeline is it began production when our old friend Jeffrey Katzenberg was part of the Walt Disney Company. And it has been suggested by a number of people that DreamWorks' The Road to El Dorado was conceived by Katzenberg, inspired by the early drafts that he saw of this at Disney, but to get it out sooner and to be more comedic and light-hearted. And then as a result, it's been suggested that Disney caught wind of this and they changed and made their film more comedic. I think the production team are pretty much in agreement that that's unrelated in this case, and it was just a case of the original film falling into development hell for too long. And producer Randy Fulmer, who had been brought into the project, was given just 2 weeks to completely turn it around, or it was just going to be shut down. And this was the direction they chose to go in. And the end result is, as I say, the most overtly comedic of the animated classics. Definitely even more so than something like The Road to El Dorado, which, whilst comedic, is still a very traditional narrative. So yeah, it's interesting that this is the first case I think we have between DreamWorks and the animated classics. Obviously, we've had Pixar and DreamWorks have been competing since A Bug's Life, where Jeffrey Katzenberg was like, we'll do our own bug movie, except we don't understand what to make bug movies about, so we'll just turn a Woody Allen movie into a bug movie somehow.
Let's dive into the plot of The Emperor's New Groove. So obviously this is very loosely based on sort of apocryphal tale of the Emperor's New Clothes, but it's about the llama. Now, the first thing we get is...
Okay, Ben, please explain to me how this is based on the Emperor's New Clothes, other than the name.
Look, Liam, I don't have a response to that.
I'm just looking for the part of the Emperor's New Clothes where, after realising he's not wearing any clothes, he has to team up with a local peasant to get back home.
Look, it's about an emperor, and there's a change for them. And they need the common folk to help them realise... Alright, I'm off the mark there. So... let's talk about setting. One thing that has carried over from Kingdom of the Sun is the setting, which is ancient Incan Empire. And I actually think this is a really good decision because really this film could be set anywhere. The setting isn't relevant to the plot. But what it does do is give us an opportunity to have a totally different aesthetic and style to it. You know, they could have just set this in your classic Cinderella, vague European medieval castle era, but doing this, I think it just gives the film a bit more of an identity.
That's a really good point, because when I was watching it today, I was thinking how contemporary the film actually is, and you're right, it could be set anywhere, and I think maybe it's a little bit detrimental. I would have liked to see maybe more celebration of the setting and the culture, but that's clearly not the tone they were going for, so it would be a very different film if they did that. As you say, you can just take the story and the characters and just put them in any setting you want.
I think if they'd leaned into that more, it would have maybe teetered on being a bit disrespectful or a bit cultural appropriation-y, but because this film's so stupid and irreverent, I don't think it can come across that way because it's not taking anything seriously, so the fact it goes for this setting doesn't really matter. Let's talk about the characters then. So we open with our titular emperor, Kuzco, voiced by David Spade, and the first 10 minutes or so the film is dedicated to exploring his complete self-obsession, the ludicrous levels to which he indulges himself, and we also get a bit of a framing device. We see what happens to him after all this, where he is a lonely llama crying in the jungle, and then we see the life he lived beforehand, and that just gives us a little bit of a framing device where he's narrating it and emphasising how it's all about him.
There are three things that I hate more than anything in any film, and that is narration, starting not at the start of the story, and David Spade.
If you didn't go down that route, I was going to be like, surely David Spade is one of them. In some ways, it's great casting, because I don't think you're ever really meant to like Kuzco.
Oh, it's perfect casting. I genuinely just do not get David Spade, and I think really that extends to basically all of the alumnus from that era of SNL. It's just not something I understand. And I think I'm being genuinely serious there, where if David Spade is in a project, it's usually just a big red flag for me that I'm not going to enjoy it. This, however, is perfect casting and is definitely the most enjoyable David Spade has ever been. And you're right, it's because we just have this ludicrous opening where he is ridiculously arrogant and self-centered, and again, I don't normally like narration, but it works so well because we actually have, it's almost a joke about unreliable narration, because we have Kuzco telling us one thing, but we, the audience, are seeing literally the opposite. We see how horrible and self-centered he is while he's telling us he's such a nice person. And I don't think I've ever really seen that kind of joke about unreliable narrator in film before.
And they even deconstruct it later on, where it catches up to the point where we started the film, and the narrator says, "You see, I didn't deserve any of this," and then the real life Kuzco says, no, they've seen everything, they know that you did. Again, there's a lot of meta humour in here for a film that is effectively for children.
Oh, the fourth wall is broken fairly regularly, and I think it works quite well. So we're introduced to Kuzco, who, as I say, is the most arrogant and really hateable character, and we're told that he's our protagonist, and I think that's quite bold of a Disney film to do, to centre it on someone who is so unlikable to their core.
The highlight for me in this opening is that Cusco has his own personal theme song guy, and it's just Tom Jones.
I like the reveal as well that it's a non-diegetic theme song, and then after a certain point he introduces his theme song guy. You're like, oh no, that guy has just been there singing this
from inside a cake.
My favourite part of this opening is that in order to really sell how terrible a person Cusco is, they have him throw Piglet out of a window.
We're also introduced to a few other characters in this section. So we get John Goodman's character Patcher, who is just a very fatherly, kind, simple figure. Again, John Goodman's tones really suit this role. One
thing I love about the introduction of Patcher is, again, we have this unreliable narrator where as soon as Patcher walks on screen, we have this completely endearing theme playing over him. Meanwhile, Cusco is telling us that he's a terrible person who ruined his life.
And the other two characters we're introduced to, who, again, maintaining perfect casting. We have Yzma, the seemingly endlessly old advisor to the crown, who also has her own desires to take power. And in what's quite a weird subtext, she seems to have basically a young, muscular toy boy. Like, Cusco says, oh, she gets a new model every decade or so. This one's name's Kronk. Let's just take a moment to talk about Kronk.
I have complained before about characters in Disney films whose only purpose is to be comic relief. But hot damn if Kronk just doesn't work perfectly as just an entirely comic relief film in an already overtly comedic film.
I think it works for a few reasons.
Well, number one reason is Patrick Warburton.
Oh, don't get me wrong, I love Kronk. I love the performance by Patrick Warburton. I love the way he's drawn. I love the premise of the character. I just love saying the word Kronk. I think the reason it works is he feels quite unique. You know, he's not a wisecracking type character. If anything, he's very stupid, but he's also very lovable, and I think that works really well. He doesn't feel like he's just genie light. He feels quite distinct, and also he's not really breaking the fourth wall or making pop culture references, or certainly no more than anyone else in this film is.
The setup we have here for a villain duo is so unique. I can only imagine it would just be as if it was Jafar, but Iago was a good-natured idiot.
Whereas what he is a bad-natured idiot. There's a bit later on where Yzma and Cusco are talking, and he asks her how old Kronk is, and she says she doesn't know, which I just find really weird and creepy. Yzma, by the way, is voiced by Eartha Kitt, most famous probably for singing Santa Baby, which, again, is just odd. But an excellent performance.
I'm not sure whether to put this down to the voice actors themselves or the animators who came in after the fact and brought it to life, but every person in this film feels perfectly cast for their character.
So we touched on John Goodman's character of Patcher. Basically, he's been called to the palace on the Emperor's command, ostensibly for something very important. All the Emperor asks is, where's the best place to catch sunlight in Patcher's village? And when he tells him, Cusco explains that it's because he's going to demolish his village to build his own summer house there. Patcher gets angry but is escorted out by the guards and dejectedly heads home. And on returning to his throne, Cusco sees that Yzma once again is trying to sort of backseat Emperor, and he fires her. And in response to that, she decides she's going to try and kill him.
If I can kind of cut through to the heart of this film, what the plot of this film basically is an excuse to just have lots and lots of jokes in scene after scene. Really, the plot is secondary in this film, but that's not to say it's a bad plot. I really love how clear the character of Yzma is. Her motivation is set up immediately. She is obviously villainous from the design to the ridiculous performance, and right away we're let into her plot, which is she's going to kill Cusco and take over as the new emperor. And her plan to kill Cusco is wonderful. She's going to invite him to dinner and poison him, which is a fairly simple plan, but despite that, really what sells this scene is that Kronk takes the dinner part the most seriously.
Well, you say that's her plan. Her original plan is to turn Kuzco into a flea, put him in a box, put that box in another box, post that box to herself, and then smash it with a hammer. And that's just the level of, like, Looney Tunes level stupidity that we're working with. Very genuinely, I find it hard to know what parts of this film to talk about on this podcast, because as you say, it's just a bunch of dumb jokes. And there is a very well structured plot there. I think the plot is done very well, but yeah, it's just nonsense. But yeah, Kronk's worrying about burning his spinach puffs more than worrying about committing regicide is fantastic.
Kronk is definitely the star in this scene. He poisons Kuzco's drink, but is distracted by his spinach puffs, comes back, forgets which drink is which, so has to mix them all together, letting Kuzco drink the poison, but having to indicate to Yzma not to drink them. It's all just set up for just joke after joke after joke. It is, I think, this first 10 minutes is probably more joke-dense than we've had in any other film. Like, as in compared to the entirety of, say, something like The Lion King. Maybe Aladdin, because Aladdin has the genie throughout the runtime, but still the density of jokes from every single character is so high.
And I think they do a great job of just injecting this film with energy as well. Like, again, on paper, the plot is Yzma goes away to her lab to conspire how to poison the Emperor. And that could easily be your sort of classic evil queen, like dark and dingy. But no, it's her and Kronk going on a roller coaster ride and ending up in lab suits. And this, again, there's like drinks exploding and, you know, they're throwing drinks over their shoulders and all sorts of stuff. And it's just a dinner scene. And I think they've just sat down and gone, right, how can we make this scene bigger? How can we make it wackier? And it just means you're always entertained.
With you mentioning the energy, one thing I think I only really noticed and appreciated on this watch was actually in this scene, which was that they know how to alternate effectively between wit and written jokes and visual gags, and they're constantly switching between the two, which keeps the energy up. Because if it was just line after line after line of joke, I think it would wear on the audience, whereas having that break of something as simple as a quick puff of smoke as you pour poison into a drink and then repeating it with the 1, 2, 3 as he mixes again, like that is a visual joke that is giving you a break from comedic dialogue, which I think is really important for not exhausting the audience with.
So for various stupid reasons, Kuzco is not in fact killed, but is merely turned into a llama. Yzma sends Kronk out to finish the job, and Kronk throws him into the river so that he'll...
Hang on, we've skipped over something there, which is, instead of being killed, he's turned into a llama.
Look, all I knew going into this film was that someone gets turned into a llama. So that was the one part of the film I wasn't surprised by.
The only excuse the film gives for this setup is they've confused the poison vial with essence of llama, because somehow the llama label has folded on itself to look like a skull. And the more I think about it, the more I think, how does that even work? It's just such a throwaway excuse because it doesn't matter. The point is Kuzco is now a llama.
To be fair, Kronk does challenge Yzma and say she should label her poisons better. So Kronk sneaks through the city. I say sneaks. People just look at him. Even when he's trying to be sneaky. So he throws Kuzco in the stream so that he'll go over a waterfall and die, and everything's huge and has these massive zoom outs. And then Kronk has an angel and devil appear on each shoulder, and you're like, okay, we're doing this trope. And it's just so weird. Like, the way the devil convinces him that he should let Kuzco die. One is he insults the angel, then he starts doing single-handed vertical push-ups, and then they just stop all that, and he just goes and saves Kuzco. It's just like, what is this?
It's probably my favourite joke in the film is the devil being like, reason number 2, look what I can do. And Kronk is like, I don't see what that has to do with it. And the angel says, no, he has a point.
Well, my favourite joke in the film, which also relates to them, is much later where there's a callback to this at the finale of the film. And Kronk's pausing as to whether he should stab Kuzco, and then it cuts to Yzma and Kuzco just looking at him, talking to his shoulders, and there's nothing there.
But as you say, Kronk decides to intervene. He manages to grab the sack just in time and is planning on leaving the city and sort of dumping him in the wilderness, but trips on some stairs, loses track of the bag, and it ends up on the back of Patch's cart as he is leaving the city.
Just on the subject of these stairs, they're incredibly steep and they give me anxiety just looking at them.
Oh, the visual design of this city is just ridiculously anxiety-inducing. Everything is sharp and steep and exaggerated. I think what you said earlier about Looney Tunes is a perfect comparison. It's very, very wacky, the world design.
So Patcher heads back and we meet his family, including his wife Chicha. I'm going to say I think she's underrated, but I think she's one of the low-key best parts of this film. Now, she doesn't get a huge number of laughs. Her and Patcher generally don't. They're kind of the emotional heart of this film. But there's a few things I really like. I think, first off, to my knowledge, she's the only pregnant Disney character we ever see, certainly human character. And it's not really made a big deal of, it's just a thing, which I feel is exactly the way you should do representing different people in different situations. And to normalise it is just say, okay, this character's pregnant, that's a thing, it's an everyday part of life. And again, even though she is pregnant and she is a mother, I think they avoid a lot of the stereotypes generally. I think Patcher and Chicha, they are there to be paternal parental figures for the audience and for Kuzco as much as they are for their own children. So I don't necessarily think there's a gendered part of that. And we see that Patcher and Chicha do sort of share parenting. They're not particularly funny, but I think they do them really well.
I'll have to add as well that I think, once again, this is just a fantastic voice performance with perfect casting. I think Wendy Malick as Chicha is excellent. There's a kind of wit and sardonic tone to her voice that is perfect with the writing.
She never lets anyone pull the wool over her eyes, even when later on Yzma and Kronk are pretending they're Patcher's relatives. Just the whole time her eyes are narrowed and she's just like, this is obviously not true.
And so it's at this point that Patcher discovers that Kuzco has ended up on his cart. He's shocked there's a talking llama, quickly establishes that it's the Emperor, and now we have the point of this film, which is it's a buddy film, and hot damn if I don't love buddy films.
So the setup here is that Kuzco wants Patcher to take him back to the palace so he can go back to living his normal life, and Patcher's reluctant to until Kuzco decides that he's not going to demolish Patcher's village. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some really nice stuff in the upcoming sequences, but there's quite a lot of back and forth. Basically, there's 3 sections of Kuzco and Patcher reluctantly teaming up, Patcher thinking Kuzco's changed, and then Kuzco's still selfish, so Patcher loses faith, and then they do that 3 times.
Honestly, Ben, I'm not sure what else you're expecting. That's classic buddy film formula. You've got to face certain obstacles together, and it's only by the end that you're working together effectively as a team. And as we've said, the plot of this story is very much secondary. The point is just to deliver gag after gag after gag.
I put it to you that in a good buddy film, both the buddies should learn something from one another. I don't know what Patcher gets out of this relationship.
He gets being friends with the most powerful person in his country.
Ah, yes, that is pretty good, to be fair.
That's a very good point, though. Patcher's character arc in this is basically non-existent. I don't really think he changes. He's the character he is at the start, at the end of the film. But at the same time, I think Kuzco has a large enough character arc for the both of them, really.
I mean, Kronk gets a character arc. The subtitle for this film for me is Big Chunky Men with Hearts of Gold. I also like, because this section kind of leads into what I think is the best way for Disney to be self-referential, where it's not explicitly saying, we are doing this. We get that coming up in a film shortly, and I don't think it works at all, but we get a few sequences which have very clear overtones and borrowed beats from other famous Disney sequences, just with a comedic twist. So we get a sequence where Kuzco tries to make it through the forest himself, which is kind of a spin on Snow White when she's going through the forest, but it's just so ridiculous and over the top. There's a bit where a fly gets caught in a spider's web and just in this little voice is saying, "Help me!" and then just gets devoured. It's really, really good. And then afterwards we cut back to Yzma announcing to the Empire that Kuzco's dead, and the lighting and the framing is very similar to Scar saying that Mufasa's died. But then Yzma's just like, well, he's not going to get any more dead. And then it's all just big and silly again.
Just business as usual, but let's rebrand everything for Yzma. I think the 3 challenges show the developing relationship slightly. So the first one is literally Kuzco accepting that he needs help and that Pacha obviously can't just let him die in the jungle. So, of course, he's going to help him. The second one, then, there's a very stupid betrayal where they've shaken on it, the fact that Kuzco is not going to demolish the village, and as they're crossing this rickety bridge, Pacha falls through, and Kuzco immediately gloats and walks away, saying, well, I was just going to have you arrested, but this is much easier. But in true karma fashion, they end up both falling into the chasm just above a crocodile-infested river, and this is where the first time they have to work together.
Would you say that's llama karma?
Oh, God. You know, that's my own fault for mentioning the word karma. So this second beat is different from the first. This is them actually teaming up.
I can't argue with that. And also, again, I think the jokes belie how well structured this film is, because we get a very visual representation of them having to team up. They're back to back above this ravine, and they have to link arms and then push against each other and climb out of the ravine. And again, we get a callback to that at the finale of the film, showing they've learned how to work together, but also it's a visual representation of them working together and having to link up. So, yeah, like, I genuinely think this is really well handled.
This set piece also has another joke I really enjoy, which is just when they're walking up the wall and Kuzco has to push Pacha up, and he just says it's a good thing you're not a big fat guy or something, otherwise this would be really difficult. Again, just perfectly delivered by David Spade.
I feel more than anything, this episode might just be us just saying lines we like from the film, and then they just end up covered in scorpions.
Oh no, covered in scorpions, which then leads to Kuzco getting a mouthful of bats that somehow propels him up. Like, the bats are what save them, and I don't quite understand how, but they just give each other this look of like, well, that was lucky.
Meanwhile, Yzma's got out of Kronk that he didn't actually kill Kuzco, so Kronk and Yzma go out looking for him. We get a really nice visual joke of Yzma sort of plotting and planning, and she's got this little sort of talk pipe to Kronk, and we see Kronk talking back, and then the joke is that she's just in this...
kind of like a cross between a tent and a rickshaw, except rather than being pulled along, it's literally just on Kronk's back.
Yeah, and he's just running along talking to her, running through the forest. It's so stupid.
Which leads us to the third of our kind of buddy encounters, which is after going the long way round, and I can't really remember the setup, but they just decide that they need food, and I think, hey, they just need food.
Look, they came up with, they want to do something with all 4 of these characters in a restaurant, and then they just worked backwards to, I guess they'll just say separately that they're hungry.
And so Pacha and Kuzco disguise Kuzco as his wife, I suppose, and they go to this, it's just a diner, like, it's just a modern American diner, but in ancient Incan jungle.
Again, just a really good line where the waitress is so, like, stony-faced and unhappy about it all, and they're playing up that they're this young couple, and Pacha's like, we're on our honeymoon, and she just says, God bless you for coming out in public.
But then we also get a kind of related visual gag, which I really love, which is when Kuzco is walking into the kitchen to talk to the chef. Just a man at the bar stares at Kuzco, looks at Pacha, and winks.
It's at this point where you're like, most of these jokes aren't aimed at children.
No. I don't think the jokes are aimed at all. I think they're just throwing them wildly.
Yeah, that's very fair.
But as you say, this is all just a setup for Yzma and Kronk also needing a break and arriving at the same diner. And yeah, it's just a scene with the 4 of them interacting. First, we have Kronk wondering where he recognises Pacha from. And I think this is just after Pacha overhears Yzma and Kronk talking about how they're after Kuzco and that they need to kill him because Kronk is a fool and it's all his fault. And so Pacha realises he needs to get him and Kuzco out of there as soon as he can.
Then just 5 minutes of dumb visual jokes. Somehow Kronk ends up taking over the kitchen and having to manage some orders. It's a whole dumb thing that happens.
And this all ends with Pacha taking Kuzco and running out and explaining that a terrifying woman and her big muscly manservant were looking for him and were trying to kill him. And this is the moment in our buddy film where they fall out because Cusco, he doesn't know that they're responsible, so he believes they can take him back to the palace, and he thinks that Patcher is just lying to him because he's like, if you're the one that takes me back, I have to uphold my end of the deal, whereas I have a way of getting home. You don't care about me, you just care about your village. They have their falling out. As far as buddy film end of second act falling outs go, it's fairly simple but really effective, because as soon as they've parted company, Cusco overhears Yzma and Kronk talking about the fact that they're trying to kill him. So right away he's caught up to speed, and I think is this where we catch up with the narration at the start?
Yeah, Cusco can't go back with Kronk and Yzma. He's lost Patcher, so he decides he's just going to try and live as a llama.
That's such a weird sentence, hearing it.
It's particularly weird in the context. So we often talk on this podcast about, things like the 3-act film structure and character arcs and things like that. And, we talk about when a character's at their lowest point. So Quasimodo is chained up in Notre Dame and is going to have to watch Esmeralda burned at the stake. Or Ariel has lost her voice, she's lost her freedom, and she's lost Eric. And in this, Cusco doesn't know his way home, so decides he's just going to have to live like a llama.
And it doesn't even last that long. Almost immediately, he's in the field, gets rejected by the other llamas, and overhears Patcher explaining their story to the llamas. And it's at this point, after, 3 minutes apart and about 30 gags, that they decide to team up again, and they'll go back to the city together to try and fix Cusco, because they won't be able to get help from Yzma like the original plan was.
So meanwhile, with Kronk and Yzma, Yzma's sleeping in a portable tent and Kronk's just sleeping under the stars.
No, he's not. He's got a tiny tent over his crotch.
I've never even noticed that.
It's a wonderful visual gag.
Don't know how they got away with that. And he suddenly wakes up and he says, "That peasant in the diner, he didn't pay his bill." And he goes back to sleep. And then he wakes up and says, "Wait, he was the guy who's got Cusco." So him and Yzma have to rush off to find Cusco. So we end up with Yzma and Kronk pretending to be related to Patcher and waiting for him to come back. This mostly involves Kronk doing some skipping with the children. There's some nice stuff where Yzma's distracting Chicha, and then she goes to join in the skipping to plot with Kronk, and then does this cartwheel back into the chair. It's, again, just really high energy nonsense.
Great writing as well. When they are, I say found out, they were never fooling anyone, but when they're found out and they're locked in the cupboard, Yzma says, "Let us out now and we'll burn your home down." To which Kronk suggests, "Don't you mean, oh?" And it's just that one of those quick jokes of this woman is just a caricature of maniacal evil. It's great.
And again, just a really nice opportunity just to mix up the visuals. So they have Kronk and Yzma in the dark, and all you can see is their eyes and sometimes their mouth. And again, this is just, there's no reason for this to be in the film, but they just went, hey, how can we make this scene more interesting? Because on paper, all this scene is Yzma and Kronk go back to Patcher's house and they talk to his family and then they leave again. And that's really hard to make interesting. But again, they just play around with it a lot.
Again, for a comparison, look at something like the scene in Snow White when the evil queen disguises herself and visits Snow White. That's how you do that scene dramatically. And here they're just we're just going to have fun.
Cusco's trying to race back to the palace to get the potion that will turn him back into a human, and Yzma's racing back to stop him. We get a particularly weird meta joke of seeing them run across the map, and there's a little coloured line tracking where they've been, and then we see Kronk and Yzma looking at this line that's appearing below them and just shrugging at each other. And then when Cusco and Patcher arrive, Kronk and Yzma are already there. And Kronk just says, "Yeah, I don't know how this happened. It doesn't make any sense."
Yeah, because Cusco says, "I don't understand. How did you get back here before us?" Yzma can't answer it. She looks to Kronk. He literally pulls out the map with their trails on. And it's just I don't know. Again, I really like that these are the kind of questions that nitpickers, people looking for plot holes, like to criticize in films. And with this film, they're setting them up for jokes. It doesn't have to make sense in terms of the plot if it can provide a joke.
And provided it's keeping the tone consistent, I think that's what's key here. We talked a lot about how Hercules is probably trying to do too much in too short a space of time. And really, I think Hercules is trying to be both this film and Pocahontas at the same time. It's trying to be a dramatic, meaningful love story that's epic and has all these fantasy elements, and it's trying to be irreverent and stupid and fourth wall breaking, and you can't really do both.
And so they're in the lab. We are well and truly into our third act. Kuzco checks the potion, sees that the human essence, I suppose it would be, the potion that will turn him back into a human, is missing.
I don't want to know what human essence is, by the way. In fact, I definitely don't want to know what llama essence is.
Kuzco confronts Yzma. Chaos ensues. The human essence gets mixed in with all the other essences. They're trying to find which is which. Yzma calls the guards, telling them that Pacha and Kuzco are the ones that killed the Emperor. They run after them. More chaos ensues. All of the guards get hit with the various essences and turned into different animals, which, not to just, again, talk about jokes that I love, but great joke in this bit where there's just a pause, and then one of the guards, who's a cow, says, I've been turned into a cow. Can I go home? And Yzma says, okay, you can leave. Does anyone else have problems? All the other animals just go, no, we're okay.
Again, just an excuse for a silly, energetic sequence. So they're being chased by these animal guards. Kuzco's trying all these different potions and turning into all these different animals.
Great joke where he turns back into a llama and is really happy to be a llama again before realising how stupid that is.
Also, we brushed over it, but when Kronk fails to kill Kuzco again, Yzma drops him down a trapdoor, and Kronk's had enough of her being horrible, and she's had enough of him not doing what she wants him to, basically. And then we end with this climax of Yzma, Pacha, and Kuzco fighting on the outskirts of the city above a huge drop, and for reasons, Yzma turns into a cat.
Great visual joke, kind of referencing and harkening back to Jafar turning into the snake, because he gets enveloped in the cloud of smoke and you just see his eyes, and here we see Yzma drink the potion. There's a cloud of smoke and darkness. You just see these menacing eyes and laughing, and then slowly the laughter becomes high-pitched and the reveal that she's just a kitten.
And we get the key character moment for Kuzco where he's got the choice of grabbing the vial or saving Pacha, and of course he's learned his lesson and he chooses the selfless thing and saves Pacha. This sequence also has, I think, my favourite joke in the whole film where... You know what it's going to be.
I know what it is, yeah.
Yzma's falling seemingly to her death in a classic Disney villain fashion, and then we cut to the very bottom of this in the city. And a guard is saying to a guy who's got like 10 trampolines on a car and one in front of him. And the guard says, how many times do I have to tell you we didn't order a giant trampoline? Which is funny enough, because obviously it sets up for Yzma to bounce off and go back up. But the response from the guy is, why didn't you tell me that before I set it up?
Which is then just broken by Yzma holding the human essence, landing on the trampoline and bouncing right the way back up.
So dumb.
And hijinks ensue, lots of gags. Yzma is defeated in a perfectly comical way, and Kuzco and Pacha have to get the essence. They do the teamwork back, walking up a cliff thing they did earlier. They get the essence and everything's back to normal.
And although this is a very silly, light film, again, I always praise Disney films where there's some parallels between the villain and the hero. In fact, I praise any narrative that does that. And even though this is pretty light, again, we get a very simple parallel of Kuzco starts only thinking about himself but learns to work with other people, whereas Yzma starts having a slightly fractious relationship with Kronk and decides she's better off by herself, and because of that, she fails and Kuzco succeeds, which again is quite a neat little narrative.
And so we cut to life as normal. Kuzco is saying goodbye to Pacha, and as Pacha is leaving, Kuzco tells him that he lied to him. He went all over that village and never once heard the singing that he was told about, so he's decided he's not going to build his summer home there. A really nice little bit of character growth where he's framing it as selfish reasons, but clearly, again, you can tell in the performance, I can't believe I'm saying it, but well done, David Spade, that he cares about Patcher, and that's his character arc.
It's really nice. We also see him making other amends. He catches up with the person he threw out a window, and the other joke that is contender for my favourite joke in this is the old man says, "Isn't the first time I've been thrown out of a window, and it won't be the last."
I just find John Fiedler's voice just endlessly endearing, so I'm always happy for him to show up. And with that, we cut to a little bit further in the future. We see Cusco in his new summer home, just a little village house on the hill next to Patcher's. And one thing I love is accompanying this, we have theme song guy again, but whereas at the opening of the film he was singing about despots and tyrants, great way of opening your film, he's now singing about like togetherness and just being a good person. And yeah, we see Cusco interacting happily with Patcher and his family. Chicha gives him his own poncho, which has a llama on it, which I think is very nice. Also, the baby has been born. Great way of showing a passage of time there. And then, one last joke with Kronk as the leader of the weird Squirrel Scouts, with Yzma also learning to speak squirrel with the kids.
She's still a cat, by the way.
Yeah, she's still obviously still a cat, which is great. And the film ends, and we hard cut to a completely tonally inappropriate ballad over the credits.
A ballad by Sting, no less. Now, this is another hangover from Kingdom of the Sun, which originally Sting composed, I think, 8 different songs for. It was going to be a classic Disney musical. Again, they very much were originally going in the direction of The Lion King, where obviously they've got Elton John in to do these big sort of power pop ballads. And musically, this is the only hangover from that. And I think it's a terrible decision, because you've just got this really upbeat, stupid Tom Jones song going on just beforehand, which really suits the tone of this film. And then, bam, terrible ballad over the credits.
And that is The Emperor's New Groove, Disney's most energetically exhausting comedy to date.
So before we give our final thoughts on The Emperor's New Groove and decide whether we think it's worthy of going on our list of the best Disney animated classics, the hallowed list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics, Liam, is there anything else we need to talk about regarding The Emperor's New Groove?
There is just one thing, and it's going to be an interesting one this time, considering how overtly wacky the film is, but we need to decide which character we think is the sexiest. Usually this is a case of talking about maybe unnecessarily sexualized characters in a children's film. I don't really think that's the case here at all, but we still need to make a choice. So Ben, who is the sexiest character in The Emperor's New Groove, and why is it everyone's lovable hunk, Kronk?
For a film that has a surprising amount of innuendo, it's actually quite a sexless film. There's no romance subplot, which again is incredibly rare for Disney. I mean, obviously, Patcher and Chicha are a couple, and they are romantic towards each other, but it's certainly not sexualized. I love this weird decision to give Yzma this hunky toy boy. It's such a baffling choice tonally, and yet it just works incredibly well. Yeah, I think Kronk is the ideal instance of a character where I think less is more, which is ironic given he's absolutely massive. And also, even though the relationship between them is kind of a bit ambiguous, like they don't sleep in the same room or anything, there's a bit where he's talking to a squirrel, and I know that sounds weird. He's talking to a squirrel about his relationship with Yzma, and he sort of says, oh, you know, there's a wall there, she's very hard to get to. So there just seems to be quite a genuine affection between the two of them, which just makes it all the more bizarre. Also, we touched over the squirrel thing, but just hearing Patrick Warburton in his very overly stereotypically masculine voice saying, squeakity squeak squeak, I always enjoy.
Obviously, I'm in complete agreement there. So quite happy to say that Kronk is the sexiest character in The Emperor's New Groove, which just leaves us to decide whether or not we think this film deserves a spot on the Waly Gisnep list of animated classics. Ben, can you retrieve the list?
I can indeed, if you'll just pull the lever. No, the other lever. Yes, here we are. Here is the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics. It's got a lot bigger recently coming out of the Renaissance. I think these next few films are going to be more interesting, let's say. But we're not talking about those. We are talking about The Emperor's New Groove.
So this is a really interesting one. If we haven't sold this enough, this is completely unlike anything else in the animated classics, and really just a surprise curveball from Disney in general. There's a solid, serviceable plot, but ultimately this is just about being as overtly comedic and having as many gags as possible. Now, when I try to deem whether a film is successful or not, it's entirely about whether it achieves what it sets out to do. Now, this is a bold claim, but I do not think there is a single joke in this film that doesn't land for me, and that is a lot of jokes.
I think it has the airplane thing going for it, where if there's a joke you didn't like, don't worry, there'll be another one along in 10 seconds.
But my claim is, I don't think there is a single joke that doesn't land for me. And obviously that's going to be subjective. This is the difficult thing with comedy. It's always going to be subjective to the person, but watching this today, every single joke, at the very least I understood how it was a joke and I enjoyed it, and most of them were making me actually audibly laugh. So considering the intent here is to be overtly comedic, I think this film succeeds in that regard, absolutely. So much so that I would go as far as saying, not only do I think this is 100% deserving of being on the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics, I think this is one of the best family comedies out there.
So, in measuring how good a film is, you mentioned, does it set out to do what it tries to do? And I totally agree that The Emperor's New Groove does. However, I also said that about Alice in Wonderland, and I didn't want to put that on the list because I struggled to connect with it. One thing The Emperor's New Groove has, which is more of a hurdle for it than maybe any other Disney film, is it's so reliant on comedy, whereas a lot of Disney films are reliant on music and songs. And the difference between those two things is, the more you listen to a song and the more you watch a musical, the more familiar you become with that and the more you can sing along and the more engaging it is. So musicals generally hold up very well to rewatches. Comedies, on the other hand, when you know the punchline to a joke, it can still be funny. Don't get me wrong, there's some fantastic delivery in this film, but I think it is diminishing returns. So for me, I've seen this film I think 3 times, and every time I've enjoyed it a little bit less. Whereas something like The Hunchback of Notre Dame, I enjoy it a little bit more every time. So I find this film really, really hard to judge. I'd go so far as to say this is the one I've been the most on the fence about. I honestly don't know. I'm going to go with my gut. And what my gut says is, a film should make me feel something. And I don't quite know that The Emperor's New Groove makes me feel enough. Even though it does make me laugh, I don't know if I find it funny enough to make the cut. This is a funny film, don't get me wrong. And it's the funniest Disney film, but I don't think Kuzco gets a lot of laughs. I don't necessarily think that character is particularly funny. And maybe if the visual style was just a bit more appealing, and I know I've praised it a lot in terms of its extremity, but it's not particularly engaging to look at. It's fine, is what I'm saying, basically. So I don't know if this is the right decision, but for me it's a no.
Well, in regards to feeling, this film makes me feel like David Spade can actually do something worthwhile, and for that alone I'm very happy to make the case for it going on the list, because that's impressive. So we're in one of the rare situations where we're not in agreement, which means for now it will go on the back of the list, ready for you to decide. We want to know what you think of The Emperor's New Groove. Do you think that being so overtly comedic is in its favours, or like Ben, do you think that comedy will always have diminishing returns and you need something more substantial there to back it up? So for now, it is on the back, waiting to hear from you. And also, while you're at it, let us know who you think is the sexiest character, even though it's clearly the muscly hunk that is Kronk.
If you did enjoy the podcast, as I'm sure you're aware, we'd really appreciate liking and commenting, and indeed subscribing if you're not done so already. Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics is released on SoundCloud, Spotify, and also a special enhanced version on YouTube. Not only do we put out our flagship podcast every week where we review the Disney Animated Classics canon, but we also put out a series of other content, including done video edits and interviews with those people who worked on the films. And speaking of films, Liam, which film are we looking at next time?
Next time, Ben, we are continuing Disney's post-Renaissance trend of experimentation. We're going from an overtly comedic buddy film, and we're reversing right the way back out to a more traditional narrative, but this is Disney's first take on a proper adventure serial. We are going to be looking at 2001's Atlantis, The Lost Empire, a film that I've not seen in some time, and I'm quite excited to revisit and see how it holds up, because this is definitely an era where each of the films produced by Disney is very unique from the rest of the catalogue, and I think the same is true for Atlantis as was here, so I'm really excited to look at this.
So if you're watching along at home, make sure to get Atlantis The Lost Empire watched and join us next time for Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics.
He's the king of the world. Do you like him?